All right, good morning, everyone. Good to be with you on another Sunday here. This is a Sunday morning video. You're not watching the wrong video, okay? But hopefully you guys are enjoying your Sunday so far, and hopefully you're able to watch the main service. Either we're there, hopefully Saturday night, or be able to watch that this morning. And so if you haven't, you should go do that after you watch this as well. But yeah, so good to be with you on another Sunday. And so for today, right, we're just going to do probably a shorter lesson here, but we're continuing that theme that I've been going through as whenever I teach on Sundays recently. I've been going through that topic of trusting the Lord, right? And so we've covered a lot of different passages, right? We've covered passages in First Peter, passage in like Second Chronicles. We talked about Habakkuk the last time I taught and everything. And this time we're going to be in Psalm 127, okay? Psalm 127. And so if you have your Bible, hopefully you do, you can turn there with me as we kind of walk through this. And really, even though I kind of mentioned like Psalm 127 as a whole, we're primarily just going to focus on the first two verses, actually, as we go through this. And I'll touch a little bit on verses 3 through 5, but the primary focus is going to be on the first two verses, okay? And as we kind of work our way through this. And so, and so again, we're going to keep touching on this theme of trusting the Lord. And what we're going to focus on a little bit here, right, is kind of as the title of this video says, like working while trusting, right? And how part of trusting the Lord, like, doesn't necessarily mean like you just sit around and don't do anything, right? Like you still act, you still do things, but you do so in dependence on God, right? And we see that truth communicated here in these first couple verses of Psalm 127. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. So we'll read the whole Psalm, okay, as we go through this, and then we'll kind of just walk through and talk about this and everything. All right, so Psalm 127, a song of ascents of Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. All right. So really pretty short psalm, right? Like only 5 verses there, pretty short. But even with that shortness, we're just going to talk about the first 2 verses, okay? Kind of focus primarily on that, as I mentioned. And I'm not going to have like points as we go through, as I normally do, like an outline and different things, because we're really trying to just hammer home this one point, okay, of that's the working while trusting, right? Like it's working in dependence on the Lord. And that's, again, what this psalm is all about. Okay, but before kind of getting there, a little context of this psalm, okay, if you notice this psalm, and even if you're looking at some of the psalms around Psalm 127, you can see the little superscript at the beginning of the psalm where it says a song of ascents, okay, a song of ascents. And your translation might have something different, but really that's what it is, right? A song of ascents. And so this is a song related to like what it's referred to, these ascents. And there's some different interpretation of what these ascents are, but kind of the interpretation I think is best and I think is most supportive of things is these series of psalms, okay, ranging from, Psalm 120 all the way to Psalm 134. Okay, these 15 psalms are called this collection of the Song of Ascents, okay? And what that's referring to is these ascents is probably that these psalms were recited by people as they went to Jerusalem, like went up to Jerusalem for like the 3 annual kind of festivals that Israel had, those religious festivals, not like a fair, Ferris wheels and all this stuff, right? Like festivals in the sense of like you had like Passover and Pentecost, right? Like those religious festivals that called for like the people to come, right? To come to Jerusalem, come to the temple and worship, right? Like, and come together in that way. And so this collection of Psalms were recited during that time, okay, on those journeys up to Jerusalem, okay, as they're ascending kind of to Jerusalem in the hill country and all that, okay. And so really the function of these Psalms is to prepare people for worship, right? Like prepare their minds and their hearts for the worship that is about to take place in Jerusalem, okay? And so so these are great Psalms, right? Like, and if you're ever wanting to like read through stuff before you go to church or different things, like these Psalms are great, right? Because they're kind of meant for that, of kind of preparing your heart for worship, okay? And so this Psalm 127, takes place kind of right in the middle of this collection, right? And I think it's very fitting to be kind of in the middle here because it's a great reminder as, again, you can picture people going up to Jerusalem, about to worship, kind of partake in the religious festivals, right? Like that are happening, okay? And the Psalm reminds them of that reality that ultimately everything they have, like all the blessings in life, all these different things, like are all a blessing of God, like God working in it, okay? And that reminder of you can't take God out of the equation, right? That he is what we need to be trusting in, right? As well as he is the source of all kind of blessings in our life, right? Like, and really that's what the Psalm lays out. And so it's a great reminder, right? As you're coming to worship, to cause people to then think upon like all the ways that God has blessed us, all the ways that God is at work in us, and also convict us of the times where we try to do things without depending on the Lord, trusting in him, and how those things often fail, right? Like they don't succeed. And so it's a great reminder in that way, okay? And so that's kind of this Song of Ascents thing, okay? But then we also see in the superscript there that it's of Solomon, right? Like, meaning it was written by Solomon, King Solomon. Okay, the Solomon you're probably picturing, you're thinking of, okay? Son of David, that king, right? And is written by him, okay? And what we're going to see as we kind of walk through even just these couple verses, you can see some similarities, right? Where of like to Ecclesiastes, actually, right? Like you can see some of those similarities brought up, that some of the things that Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes, right, are even being brought up in these first couple verses, okay? And so similar themes, and we'll talk about that as we kind of work our way through, okay? So that's kind of the context leading in. So let's just kind of walk through these couple verses, okay? And so the first verse here, right, like, unless the Lord builds a house, those who build it labor in vain. And unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And so you have Solomon using this imagery, right? He starts with kind of builders of a house, right? Builders of a house. And this could be just in general, like someone building a house, or again, if you're thinking in the context of them going to Jerusalem to worship, it could be like the temple, right? Like in different things. But Solomon is making this point that unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain, that they work all in vain. That vain meaning vanity, it's meaningless, right? It's worthless in a sense, right? And so, again, this doesn't necessarily mean, right, that like we just kind of sit back, right? Like just like if a builder was kind of like, well, I'm just going to sit here and wait for God to build this house, right? Like he's probably going to be waiting for a while, right? Like, so it isn't a call to like, hey, don't do anything, just sit there and kind of wait there. But it's just talking about how, like, even when we act in our actions, we need to be trusting the Lord, depending upon him. And if he is not involved, if we're not depending upon the Lord, like, then our efforts are in vain. Okay, our efforts are in vain. And just like someone building a house, right? And then he echoes that in the second half of verse 1 by kind of using the imagery of someone watching over a city, right? Like, and that would be very applicable in this time and with like Jerusalem and stuff, where ultimately, like if the Lord isn't guarding or protecting the city, right, especially like Jerusalem in that time, then the watchmen, the people trying to guard the city, are watching in vain, right? They're staying awake in vain if the Lord is not the one protecting them, right? Because again, just look through Israel's history, right? And you can see that very clearly, right? Where in times where it's like they kind of feel like, oh, we should be fine in this battle, right? Like we have the military strength to succeed and all that. And then the other nation like beats them, right? Like you could think of like with like Joshua and the conquest, like with the city of Ai, right? Like, and how there it's like a small town, a small city, and then so people are like, oh, we've got this, it's fine. And they go and then they get beat, right? Like, and they lose. And again, that's that lesson of like God being involved, okay? And but then there's times when Israel doesn't look like they should succeed or whatever, but they trust the Lord, right? And God defends like the city, right? Like you could think of like Hezekiah when Assyria was attacking Israel and kind of in siege of Jerusalem, and Hezekiah turns to the Lord, trusting him, like, Lord, please help, right? Like, we need you. And what? The Lord protects them, right? Like, and it's against all odds, right? They should have been wiped out, but God delivers them. And so you have this reality, right? Like that Solomon is pointing out here, like, unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain, right? Like that this, you can kind of try to plan and do all the things you want or can, but ultimately it comes down to trusting God, okay? And especially here where, again, you have this picture of someone trying to stay awake, watching over maybe on the walls of the city or whatever, right? Like just watching, looking out for any threat and wanting to go to sleep, right? Late into the wee hours of the morning, right? And it's just, that's all in vain. It's all meaningless, right? If the Lord is not the one actually like involved in it, right? If we're not depending upon the Lord, okay? So we see that imagery of builders, we see watchmen guarding a city, right? And then the third thing we kind of imagery Solomon uses to depict this truth is in verse 2, right? And we see that kind of even with like farming, right? Like in that kind of thing, right? Where it says, it is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. And so we see here, right? Again, another mention of vain or vanity. Okay, which again should kind of make us think of like Ecclesiastes, right? Where Solomon continually emphasizes that like vanity of vanities, like everything's vanity, everything's meaningless, all these things, right? And then we see this kind of, again, repetition of vain, right? The word vain is used 3 times in those first 2 verses, right? And so he is again emphasizing kind of a futile or meaningless kind of part of life in a sense, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we see even with farming, right, where it's like you rise up early and go late to rest, right? Like essentially the picture of someone who's like, yeah, just working, getting up really early, then they work all day into the late night, like as far as they can go, and then they go to bed late, right? Because they're working so hard, right? But he says what? That is all in vain, right? That's in vain when we're just trying to do that in our own strength, right? And he even talks about, right, like eating the bread of anxious toil. And what's kind of interesting about that, right, that seems to be an allusion back to Genesis chapter 3. Okay, Genesis 3, verse 17, actually, which if you remember Genesis 3, that's the chapter with the fall, right, when Adam and Eve sin and sin enters world. And then remember after they sin, right, like God pronounces these curses on like the serpent and then the man and woman and all that. But part of the curse that he gives on Adam, right, to the man in verse 17, is that the ground was cursed, right? If you guys remember that, hopefully that sounds familiar to you. And notice what he says at the end of verse 17, Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. In that kind of phrase there, like the pain mentioned there, is kind of the same root word as like the anxious toil mentioned here in verse 2 of Psalm 127. Okay, eating the bread of anxious toil, eating the bread of pain, right? Like it's that same kind of concept as the pain of kind of working the ground for food mentioned after the fall. Okay, and you're probably like, well, so what, right? Like, what's the point of that? And the point, right, is kind of like the imagery Solomon is like attaching here is that the futile work that this person who's trying to work without the Lord, right, without depending upon him, that work is like as futile as the people who were laboring like after the fall to like get food. Okay, and if you read through Genesis, you see that the ground like wasn't kind of what it is today. Okay, that actually like the flood, okay, actually helped the ground, right? It actually helped, was kind of a mercy that God did in the flood, kind of adjusted a little bit of like the ground to make it more workable, to make it a little easier to bear fruit and get food from it, right? It doesn't obviously like still today, it's not like super easy, right? But it made it easier, right? Like than it was before the flood, where it was really tough, right? Like it was really hard. And so essentially, right, what Solomon's saying is like those who try to labor without the Lord, it's like they're back in that kind of cursed condition before the flood where like it was almost impossible to get anything from the ground, right? And it's like, this is the person who's trying to toil without the Lord. That is how futile their work is just like that. Okay. And so a big deal, right? And in verse 2, in contrast to this person who's like up early, up late, working all day, working all night type of thing, to just like barely like have any like something to like any results from that, right? In contrast to that, and in verse 2, for he, referring to God, gives to his beloved sleep, right? That in contrast to the person who's like waking up super early, going to bed super late, is the person that God actually gives sleep to, right? His beloved. He gives those whom he loves sleep, okay? That sleep is actually a blessing and a gift from God, okay? And we see that here, okay? So you have on the one hand someone working super hard and toiling and all that in their own effort, in their own strength, and it's yielding little like produce from that, right? Like it's yielding minimal results. And on the other hand, you have a person who works and God blesses, and he blesses them also with sleep, right? Like that they can actually go to bed and sleep and not worry, right? And that's part of it, right? Is the not worrying about it, because that person realizes, hey, God is at work in this. Like I did what I can do, and I'm trusting that the Lord will be at work, okay? And so we see those three different imageries, right? Like of the builder, the watchman, and the farmer, right? Like all these three in these couple verses. And again, they're all hammering home that same point of the vanity, right? Of trying to do things without trusting the Lord, trying to do things in our own strength, okay? And so that's what the emphasis is here, okay? And this goes really contrary, because I think there's like that kind of that whole thought, right? Like the Jesus take the wheel, right? Like that means like when you trust God, it means like I just let go and I don't have to do anything. God will do it all for me. That's not entirely true, right? Like I think there's still like God calls us, like look at Proverbs, like to be wise, right? And to act in certain situations, right? Like and so we still work, right? Like we still like in this still need to like build the house. We still need to like work and farm, like type of thing. But we trust the Lord with the result of that. Okay. We trust the Lord with the results. And we depend on him for grace and strength in it, right? Like that's what is blessed, right? And that's where this whole idea, like you can't remove God from the situation, right? And that's where this ties into Ecclesiastes, where Solomon here is talking about these things, like when things aren't done with the Lord, if the Lord is not part of it, it is all in vain. This is where it ties heavily into Ecclesiastes, because that's like the whole emphasis of Ecclesiastes is Ecclesiastes is all about, like, if you remove God from the picture, right? If you take God out of the picture, remove him from life, then everything is meaningless, right? Everything's meaningless. That's like the point of Ecclesiastes, is to show that life is meaningless when you remove God from the picture, right? It is only when you understand like that God is at work, that God is kind of working in life and different things, like that life does have meaning, okay? And that's what Solomon brings up here as well, okay? That it is, again, as soon as you remove God from the picture, all your effort is meaningless. It's futile, right? And so that's the point, right? And that's so important for us to understand, right? Like when we talk about like trusting God and stuff, is that doesn't mean we just sit idly by, right? But rather we take steps forward, right? We still work, we still plan, right? But we do so in dependence upon the Lord, right? We trust him with the results. We trust him to be at work in it. And part of that trusting means, like, it might not always turn out the way you're expecting, right? But when you're depending on the Lord and trusting him, right? And leaving the results up to him, kind of a thing, right? Like, we try our best, we do our best, but ultimately we trust, but it's ultimately God. And whatever he kind of determines with that, we should be content with, right? And trusting him in that. And so that can be so applicable for various aspects of our life, right? That can be applicable like in school or something, right? Where you study, you work hard, you do these things, but are you trusting the Lord in it? Are you leaving those results up to him? Okay. And again, that doesn't mean like, oh, I don't need to study for my test, throw away my notes, God's got this, right? Like, no, like there's still wisdom of like, we need to study, we need to do things, but we trust God in it. And we're okay, like, if we don't get our A or whatever, right? Like, it's okay. That could be like in sports or something, right? Like, we train and we try our best in like a game or something, but ultimately we like depend on the Lord and trust him for the results, right? Like, and so it's very fitting for a lot of parts of our life where, and as you grow up, that's going to even continue to be more so, right? Where you're faced with, I'm doing everything I can do, right? But like, ultimately it's up to the Lord, right? If this is going to work out, whatever it is, right? Fill in the blank, whatever that is, where you can check off all the boxes and do all that you can, but you ultimately sometimes get brought to that point, but like, I need the Lord, right? Like, there's nothing more I can do. Okay. And so there's that reality. And so hopefully, as you kind of think about this, right? Like, are there any areas of your life that you're working and striving just in your own strength, right? Just depending upon yourself, depending upon your own plans and your own actions, right? Or are you working hard? Yes, but trusting the Lord in it, right? Like, depending upon him, right? And you can maybe ask, well, what does that look like? I don't know, like, are you praying about things? Are you bringing it before the Lord? Are you trusting him in that? And maybe when things don't go your way, are you able to be content and trust him in that? And so, I don't know, just that question to ask yourself, right? Like, are you trusting the Lord in your working? Right? Like, and so maybe you can think of different things going on in your life, but are you striving in your own strength or depending upon the Lord? That's what it really comes down to, right? That's the reality. Is it's one or the other. It's not like there's an in between, right? It's one or the other. Of, do you strive to do things in your own strength, or do you strive to do things like while being dependent upon God, trusting him to be at work, trusting him for the results? Okay. And because as we see again here, on the one side, vanity, on the one side, like blessing, right? Like, God blesses that, right? Like, and again, that blessing doesn't mean like everything's going to turn out the way you think, but that's what honors God. That's an action that honors God, is when we work in dependence upon him. Okay. So let me pray, and that will actually wrap us up this morning. All right. Lord, I do just thank you so much just for being a God who is very much at work in our lives, Lord, and forgive us for often wanting to just take things into our own hands and handle things without any regard to trusting you or seeking you in the midst of difficult circumstances, Lord. But just pray you'd work on our hearts to keep us dependent upon you, Lord, trusting you, that with whatever's going on in our lives, that we'd be able to turn those things over to you and just really trust you, Lord, as we seek to be diligent with the things that we are responsible for, but ultimately leave the results up to you, Lord, to leave that in your hands. And pray that you would humble us to do that, Lord. And so please be at work in us, because that doesn't come naturally to us. We naturally want to handle everything ourselves and not release control of situations, Lord, but help us understand that ultimately we are not in control, but only you are. And I pray that would lead to that trust, lead to that dependence upon you, Lord. And so please be at work in us. And I just praise things in your son's name. Amen. Awesome. Well, that wraps up our Sunday morning lesson, and look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday. All right. See you guys.